I recently ran across a book called Reclaiming Conversation, The Power of Talk in a Digital Age. It's by an author by the name of Sherry Turkle. She's a prof at MIT. And the premise of her book is that in this digitally driven culture we live in, we find ourselves having our ability to talk with each other being eroded, our ability to connect with each other as people and as a society. In other words, we just can't talk well and have conversations as we used to. Instead of talking, we text or we tweet or we email. And as we do that, we no longer have to look at each other. We no longer have to listen to each other. We no longer have to reveal ourselves to other people. Now, you don't have to be a prof at MIT to get that. Just look around when you're out there throughout the week as you sit in a waiting room of a doctor's office or as you stand at the checkout line at the store, as you're riding in someone's car, maybe even as you're sitting in your own dinner table. People are connecting, all right. It's just not with the person next to them. It's with whoever or whatever is at the other end of that device they're holding in their hands. Now, the problem isn't that we're too busy to talk. The problem, Sherry says, is that we're losing our ability to talk. We literally are losing the capacity to have conversations, and that is disastrous, she says, because conversations are the building block of human relationships and human society. And so if we can't talk with each other, we can't learn from each other, we can't connect, we can't build community, we can't resolve problems, and we certainly can't love our neighbors. So here we are. This is our third week of a series on trying to figure out how it is to take seriously Jesus' words, to love God and love our neighbors. How do we actually do that? And one of the things I think we've learned is that it's remarkably simple when it really gets right down to it. We learned a couple of weeks ago that loving our neighbor begins by knowing our neighbor. Getting familiar with their lives, feeling the kind of things that they feel, praying for them when we find them in great need. Last week, Chris Baker talked about how neighbors know each other and enjoy each other. They have fun together. They party together. They enjoy being with and just hanging out with each other. So far, so good, right? We get to know our neighbors. We get to simply enjoy our neighbors. This week, it's going to get a little more tricky because this week, the introverts among us are going to get nervous because neighbors not only know each other, not only enjoy each other, neighbors talk to each other. Now, I suspect it's not only the introverts here that get sweaty palms when we hear those words, because if you've ever been part of a conversation with someone and the topic begins to move toward issues of spirituality or God or church or faith, whether you're on the leading end of that conversation trying to steer it toward that topic, or whether you're on the receiving end of the conversation wondering why in the world this person's bringing up God and faith and all of that, the truth is that when people start talking with each other about God, it can get scary. It can get weird even at times, and it's certainly challenging. So if loving our neighbor involves making sure we tell them about Jesus, well, we have a whole new challenge among us, a whole scarier challenge. But what if loving our neighbor, as Jesus defines it, is a lot more simple than just that? What if we're not talking so much about conversion as we are having a conversation? What if the simple act of talking to another person qualifies as an act of love, regardless of where the conversation goes? And if that were true, the most introverted among us, the most digitally distracted among us, could actually learn this lost art of conversation. So we're going to catch up again here this morning with one of the moments in Jesus' ministry where we see him being a neighbor. And we're going to listen to the conversation he has, one of the more fascinating conversations in all of the Bible, frankly. And it's a familiar one to many of us. It's a conversation Jesus has with a woman at a well in Samaria. And so let's just listen to how John tells the story in verse 5. So Jesus came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Now, we should point out that right from the very beginning, this conversation has every reason to go absolutely nowhere. For one thing, these two are complete strangers. They have really nothing in common, no shared history at all. For another reason, Jesus is a man and the woman obviously is a female, and in that culture especially, for a man and a woman in public to speak with each other was not only highly unusual, it was almost inappropriate. And if this hadn't been enough, the third thing that was strange or difficult about it was that Jesus is a Jew and this woman is a Samaritan, and these two races really wanted nothing to do with each other as far as the Jews were concerned. Samaritans were half-breed heretics. As far as the Samaritans were concerned, the Jews were haughty, arrogant, judgmental, and intolerant. And so there are all sorts of reasons for Jesus not to engage in this conversation, and there are all kinds of ways for this conversation to go south. I mean, imagine just for a moment bumping into a neighbor that lives a couple blocks down from where you live. You bump into them on an afternoon walk. You've never met them before, and you decide in the course of this first conversation with this complete stranger, you're going to deal with issues of religion, politics, race, and gender. All in that one conversation. Now, that's what happens here. And it had every reason for this thing to go badly. And yet Jesus manages to engage this woman in a conversation that has remarkable impact, not only on her, by the way, but for a whole lot of other people as well. So how did he do it? What can we learn from Jesus about talking, just talking to our neighbors? What we're going to discover there is that Jesus demonstrates 4 skills that can enable us to rediscover the lost art of talking. And the first skill, let me suggest that Jesus practices here, is to be open, not closed. Now, we've already alluded to the fact that there were cultural reasons why Jesus had no business talking to this woman. We haven't yet pointed out the personal reasons. Jesus is tired. The text specifically tells us that. Too tired, apparently, to walk into town to get lunch. And so the disciples have gone in to get some for him. Now, apparently, all day long, he's been walking down to Samaria. Undoubtedly, as he's walked with those disciples, he's been talking and teaching them along the way. all morning long. Finally now, he's going to get a chance as he sat at the well for a little downtime, a little quiet, a little chance to kind of renew himself and such. But then, lo and behold, this woman shows up at the well, and Jesus finds the energy and the grace to enter into a conversation. See, one of the reasons we often miss out on having meaningful conversations is that we're simply not open to them. We're in such a rush to get to the next thing. We have so many things on our mind that are preoccupying us as we consider all the tasks at hand. We're so distracted maybe from the device in our hands, or we're so insecure with how people will feel about us or what they will think about us that we never even are open to having a conversation with someone. And so we actually close ourselves off from people. We don't make eye contact with people as we walk down the street. We keep our heads down, or we rush through and transaction at the bank or the store. Or sometimes we literally cross the street, take the long way back home to keep from bumping into someone we don't want to have a conversation with. So maybe Sherry Turkle has something here. We've really or are losing our ability to talk. And that's tragic because conversation is something we deep down not only want, we need. If we're going to be able to have human society and relationships, we need to figure out ways to talk with each other. But the question is, how can we do that? Well, the first thing we need to do is to be open to having conversations. And so as you think about your week, as you bump into folks, are you making eye contact with them and learning their names as you meet them, taking time to be present when you do that business with someone across the aisle? Are we creating sacred space, as Turkle calls it, for conversations to actually happen? Well, let's go back to this scenario at hand that we talked about in the video. You're at your cousin's wedding. You bump into an old acquaintance at the bar, and as you look at him, he seems to be down and a bit forlorn. The question is, are you open to a conversation with him? Now, how do you stay open to conversations with people? Well, there's probably a lot of ways. The way I begin my day each day is by a simple prayer as I'm heading out the door. Something like, Lord, show me this day who you want me to love. And just that simple phrase, maybe as you're getting on the airport, maybe as you're beginning the cocktail hour, maybe as you go into the office, whenever that might be. Lord, who do you want to show your love to? How do you want to show your love through me today? So that's the first skill that Jesus demonstrates here, to be open and not closed. The second skill Jesus teaches us is to start with the everyday issues at hand, not the eternal. People of faith often feel they are responsible to shift every conversation towards some spiritual topic. God, faith, church. Someone says to us, big game this afternoon, huh? And you say, sure am glad that Jesus won the big game for me. Now, that's just weird. And awkward. What we notice Jesus doing here is that he begins with the everyday situation that he finds himself in. He is sitting at this well. It is hot. It is midday. He is thirsty. This woman has a bucket. And so the most natural thing in the world for him to say is, can you give me something to drink? He starts with where he is, where she is. Now, our text, if you read the whole text this morning, you realize that the conversation as recorded by John seems to go awfully quickly. But chances are almost certain that there's a whole lot more to the conversation that happened that day than what John includes here in his gospel. I mean, Jesus could have gone right to her issue. Like, why in the world is she visiting this well at midday in the heat of the day when all the other women in the village would have been doing this in the cool of the morning? But Jesus doesn't begin there. He begins with the everyday stuff. So many of us underestimate the importance of small talk. Talk about the weather. Talk about the game. Talk about the kids, the market. We're so determined to get to the big stuff that we rush past the small stuff. Sometimes, because we're so sure we've got to get to the big stuff, we don't want to waste time on the small stuff, but it's the small stuff that sets the stage for something bigger that just might come. And sometimes we don't even bother involving ourselves in conversation because we're not interested in small talk. And some of us are just not interested in the big stuff to talk about it because it's so awkward. But if talking is the most human and humanizing thing you can do, then there really is no such thing as small stuff. If talking is the most human and humanizing thing we can do, then there really is no such thing as small talk. Every conversation has the potential to communicate dignity and value and delight to the person at the other end of the conversation. And so every conversation in and of itself can be an act of love. Every one. Regardless of where it leads, because you are showing and demonstrating love and care and dignity and worth to the person that you're speaking to. Now, this woman had, throughout her history, as we have it here, been treated badly by a whole lot of men along the way. And so she is just mystified that this Jesus would take any interest in her at all. But he engages her in this conversation. He asks her for a favor. He listens to her thoughts and her experience. That's the power of small talk. So Friday night on the way home, I stopped at the store to pick up a few things, and I noticed a new cashier at the end of the store that I hadn't met before. And so I practiced my small stuff. My small stuff generally is when I meet one of the cashiers to say something like, "Are you just starting your shift? Or are you almost done?" And so she began talking about that and how she'd begun the day at school. And I said, "Well, where did you go to school?" She said, "I'm going to School of Mines." I said, "Well, I almost went to School of Mines for my graduate degree." Well, and then she said, "Well, what happened? Why didn't you go?" "Oh, I decided to go to seminary instead." Well, that kind of raised a question in her eyes, but I didn't bother to go there. I didn't have time. I figured next time we talk, we can go there if she wants to. But you see, it was just small talk that began this conversation, and we're doing it as she's checking out and scanning my groceries along the way. Now, it was just a conversation. I don't know for sure where it's going to go, but just by having it, I know it brightened my day, and I'm certain it brightened her as well, because I showed her the kind of attention and care that gave her day a sense of value and appreciation. And so next time we bump into a neighbor, we can do that sort of thing. In fact, someone suggested that in our fast-paced, digitally driven culture, talking to someone, just taking time to talk to them, is the modern equivalent of giving a cold glass of water in Jesus' name. It's an act of love in and of itself. So regardless of where it leads, there really is no such thing as small talk. So start with the everyday situation at hand. That's the second thing. But sometimes small talk leads to bigger talk. And that's what happens here. Let's pick it up at verse 10. So Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with. The well is deep. How can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well, drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock?" Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water, welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." See, sometimes small talk leads to bigger talk. And as we follow this conversation, we discover that it drifts toward more substantive issues. And when you have conversations with people that begin with small talk, they often may well drift toward more substantive issues. Sometimes the guy at the bar says, "I'm doing terrible," but you wouldn't understand. And suddenly there's a door opened for you. What are you going to do? But this is where it gets tricky. And this is where it gets scary. The third skill Jesus shows us is what we need to hear. And that is, when it comes to taking the next step, we're wise to raise questions, not answers. We tend to think that conversation is about talking, when really conversation is just as much about listening. See, we tend to think as people of faith that we're supposed to have all the answers, and so we're just waiting for this opportunity to download our message into their skull. When in reality, the most loving thing we can do is often simply ask questions and listen attentively to hear what's on their heart before we begin to share what's on our heart. Remember, Jesus began this conversation with a question. Will you give me something to drink? See, he puts her in the driver's seat. He makes himself the needy one, the vulnerable one, and she becomes the expert, the provider, if you will. And we honor people when we ask for their help, when we ask for a favor, when we ask their opinion. And we encourage someone when we ask how they're doing and actually listen for the answer. And so Jesus begins this conversation with a question. And even though he doesn't frame the rest of the conversation in the form of a question, he's actually raising, in the subsequent conversation, all sorts of questions in her mind. Look at verse 10. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that gives you, who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, he would have given you living water." Jesus is asking her, in effect, what are you really thirsty for anyway? And notice how she responds, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with. The well is deep. Where can you get this living water?" See, Jesus is raising all kinds of questions in this woman's mind. Who is this guy? What is this living water? What am I looking for in life? Where can this water be found? Now, just a little background here. That expression, living water, was a kind of a common idiom of the day that described water that was moving or bubbling from a stream or from a spring, as opposed to water that was stagnant in a pond or a well or a cistern. And so bubbling water, moving water, living water, if you will, was far more preferable, far more refreshing than stagnant well water. And so what Jesus is doing is he is awakening something in her, this desire for something more, something better. And that door that he opens makes it possible to go even further in terms of what he has to say. And we can do that too. We can open doors just by asking questions of people, inviting them to tell us about themselves, about their lives, about what matters to them, about their background, and then listen attentively for their responses. And most people are eager and happy to talk about what matters to them. And they especially will do so if you're genuinely interested and will actually listen to what they have to say. And so it turns out that the secret to being a good conversationalist isn't having something to say. It's having something to ask. Tell me, did you grow up in Denver? Where'd you go to school? Do you have any family around here? What made you decide to go into teaching? See, questions like that invite someone to reveal themselves, and you get a better sense of who they are. And should the prompting of the Spirit take the conversation in a more spiritual direction, again, you can do that by simply asking questions. Did you ever go to church growing up, as I did when I was a kid? What was that like for you? So what's your take on people that call themselves Christians? Wait for an earful of that if you ask that question. I have actually asked people, so I end my day by praying. And I pray for the people that I know have needs. Is there something I can pray for you about tonight? I have said that to people I have just met. And I've done that without it feeling awkward or uncomfortable at all, because they have sensed in the conversation prior that they matter and that I care about them, whatever that is for you. And so that's the third thing I'll suggest to you. Raise questions, not answers. But if the conversation should lead toward Jesus, there's one more skill we have to learn, and that is share good news, not religion. Share good news, not religion. Look at verse 19. Sir, the woman said, I can see you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem. Woman, Jesus replied, believe me, a time's coming, and it's now come, when true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kinds of worshipers the Father seeks, because God is Spirit. His worshipers must worship him in the Spirit and in truth. The woman said, I know that Messiah called Christ is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. Then Jesus declared, I, the one speaking to you, I am he. So in the course of this conversation, it becomes clear that this woman has a checkered past. She's been married several times before. The man she's now living with, she's not married to. And so this has to be an uncomfortable moment for this woman. So because she is uncomfortable, she quickly shifts the conversation and the subject of the conversation to this age-old theological dispute between the Jews and the Samaritans on where they should worship God. Now notice how Jesus handles this. First, he doesn't get stuck in her past. He doesn't need to point out to her all her mistakes and sins. See, Jesus never begins a conversation with speech about their sin. He begins where people are. Secondly, the thing he doesn't do is he doesn't get dragged into some kind of a religious debate here. He reminds her that God isn't interested in this religion or that religion. God is interested in people. People who are genuinely seeking him. And then he says this remarkable thing at the end. I who speak to you am he. Now, how do you think he said that? Do you think he said that sternly, as if she were in trouble? I who speak to you am he. Or do you think maybe, just maybe, he said it like he was letting her in on a secret, maybe even whimsically, maybe with a wink. I who speak to you am he. I'm the one you've been looking for in all those relationships, all of your life. I'm the one. I'm the man. I'm the good news. And so that's the fourth blank I'll suggest. Share good news, not religion. Now, it's also important, worth noting, he doesn't tell her all the things he could have said. He doesn't try to answer all the questions people have. He doesn't need to get into everything. He tells her the one thing that she needs to hear that day. He is the man, whether she knew it or not, she's been looking for. He has that thing, living water, that she has always thirsted for. He is the one that can refresh her soul after all the hurts and disappointments she's experienced. And so, if we are willing to go through our day open to conversations, not closed, if we're willing to start conversations with the everyday situations that we find ourselves in, if we're willing to be sensitive to the Spirit's leading that may well sometimes shift and direct the conversation towards spiritual issues, then we get the chance to share not religion, but good news about Jesus. See, it's not about this church or that church. It's not about creation versus science. It's not about rules and regulations. It's not about all the suffering in the world. It's not about why there's so many hypocrites in the church. It's just about who Jesus is, what he's done for you, and nobody can really argue with that. In fact, a recent survey said that 78% of all people who don't go to church on a regular basis would be happy to have a conversation with a friend about spiritual matters. 78% of people who don't go to church would be happy to have a conversation with a friend about spiritual matters. We don't have to be afraid of having conversations that lead that way. We don't have to say it all at one time. Most people just need a little bit at a time. We don't have time to read the rest of the story, but what's interesting to me is we really don't know that this woman actually became a believer that day. All the text tells us, verse 28, then leaving her water jar, the woman went back to the town and said to the people, "Look, come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah?" Now, church tradition tells us that this woman did become a believer that day, but at this point, she's still asking questions. She hasn't gotten this whole thing figured out, and that's just fine, because sometimes all it is a conversation. It's one of many conversations on the journey toward faith. But what John does tell us is that many people in that town did believe because of that woman's testimony. All because on a particular noontime in the heat of the sun, two strangers met at a well and decided to have a conversation that started with some small talk and ended with some dramatic change in a whole lot of people. And so if it can happen at a well way back there in Samaria, it really can happen anywhere. It can happen really at the deli counter at the store. It can happen at the end of your driveway. It can happen at the lunchroom at work. It can happen wherever you are during the day and in the days to come. And it can happen at that bar where your cousin is getting married, when you bump into that old acquaintance who's looking a bit forlorn, who's saying, I'm doing terrible, but you wouldn't understand. And at that point, you could politely excuse yourself. You could definitely change the subject. Or you could pull up a stool and just say, try me. Neighbors talk to each other. Sometimes it's just a conversation. Sometimes it's more than a conversation. But either way, it's an act of love. And you never know where it's going to end. We know where this story finally ends. Not with the woman. She leaves history. But with Jesus. Not too many weeks later, he shows himself to be that Messiah that she wondered if he was when he went to a cross. But on the night prior, he reminded all of those followers of his of what he was doing by having that final meal with them, where he took a piece of bread and after he offered the blessing, broke it and said, "This is my body broken for you." And after the supper, he took a cup and said, "This cup is a new promise I make to all of you." So this morning as we close, we're going to invite you to join us in communion. And as we pass down the row you're in, a plate of bread and a place for you to pick up a cup, we invite you to take the time to be present with Christ and allow him to give you what you need today. He is the living water. He is the Lamb of God as well. Come, all is ready.